Okay, the title is Eastern Question on the Golden Princess, and let me begin by defining these terms. The Eastern Question in Bible prophecy was a prophetic lecture on Daniel 11, 40 through 45, presented in public meetings by early Adventist pioneers and evangelists, such as President A.G. Daniels and noted author and publishing house editor Uriah Smith. The contents of this lecture were outlined in our denominational publications, such as Bible readings for the Home Circle and Uriah Smith's book, Daniel and the Revelation. This was the lecture that our evangelists and pastors used as a means to bring the attention of the world to the Seventh-day Adventist message. We have located over 850 newspaper articles from the 1800s up to the first half of the 20th century that report on the presentation of this lecture. In 1884, Ellen White wrote the following report regarding a presentation on the prophecies of Daniel 11, 40 through 45. Then you could read this quotation in Ukrainian. So that's the quote. You quoted that you translated the quote.
Yes, that's correct.
So which brings me to the definition of the word golden princess. In 2018, my parents sent my wife and me on an all-expense paid, a 12-day round trip princess cruise from Los Angeles to Alaska. And after a few days on the sea, I gave the ship's entertainment director a copy of my book, along with the book is Jerusalem Caliphate and the Third Jihad, along with a copy of a poster advertising a prophetic lecture on Daniel 11 that I had given in Helena, Montana. I told the entertainment director that I would be willing to present this lecture on his ship. This would have been the same lecture that our pioneers gave when they went to raise up churches. So you could read this posters on the screen, just interpret that poster. So if you know anything about the nature of entertainment found on cruise ships, there was very little chance that the ship would allow such a lecture to be presented. Was I ever surprised when I received the message that I was scheduled to speak at one of the ship's premier venues? The ship publishes a daily paper that is delivered to every stateroom on the ship first thing in the morning. It provides an hourly schedule of the day's activities. Here is the wording they came up with to advertise my lecture. Then you can read what is in the red square there.
Thank you.
The lounge was packed with several hundred guests for the lecture. It was very well received. The entertainment lecturer thanked me on 3 separate occasions, and he noticed that this was listened to with people's eyes and ears and mouths open. There were people who were brought to the Lord on that ship because of this lecture. Now, there are people in the Adventist church who believe that this is a false message, that the Eastern Question in Bible prophecy was a false prophetic message. They are teaching that the king of the north in verse 45 has nothing to do with Turkey and is really the papacy. And they teach that the king of the south is not the leader of Egypt, but rather represents atheism or Islam. Is there a way to know for certain whether or not the Eastern Question that was taught for over 80 years in our church is indeed prophetic truth? Now, if we were left solely to our own interpretive abilities to understand Daniel 11, 40 through 45, we could expect to see a multiplicity of views. with everyone believing that their view is the correct understanding. And that is exactly where we are at in our church today. The founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, coming from various denominations, were just as divided on their understanding of doctrinal issues as those in our church today are divided on our understanding of Daniel 11. Reporting on one of the 22 Sabbath conferences that were held between 1848 and 1850, where our doctrinal positions were hammered out, Ellen White wrote, then you can interpret this quotation. It says, hardly two agreed. That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? If it was not for God's intervention back then, there would never have been unity on the doctrinal teachings of this church. But God promised in his word that he would intervene. By what means? Listen to what Ellen White stated. Interpret this one. Here is Ellen White's report on how this promised intervention worked for the brethren back in 1848. Okay, you can interpret this one. Ellen White also stated, interpret this one. A most important question for us to answer this evening is this. Did God give to Ellen White any indication as to whether or not the Eastern question in Bible prophecy was biblical truth? If he did, then for those who will allow the inspiration of the Holy Spirit working through the ministry of Ellen White to correct their interpretation of the Bible, it is possible that our church could come into harmony. If God did not speak through his prophet regarding the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, then unity of interpretation will be impossible to achieve. I'm going to make a case this evening that God was not silent on the Eastern question. Follow me closely. Interpret this. How can we know if Ellen White is including the prophecy of Daniel 11 as one of the prophecies that God has already made plain, thus barring the presentation of new theories on these verses? Here's my evidence that the Eastern question is prophetic truth that God has already made plain to his church. Okay, interpret this. God's Holy Spirit could not have made the truth of the Eastern question plain to the hearts of the listeners unless it was a prophetic truth that God had already made plain to his church. So the question is, when was it made plain to our church? It was made plain during a 10-year period of time, 1862 to 1872, when a thorough investigation of the books of Daniel and Revelation were made by the church. Ellen White speaks of this investigation. Okay, and interpret this paragraph. Our press rolled out the results of that investigation. Over 1 million copies of Daniel and the Revelation were printed in several languages. And regarding the leader of this thorough investigation, Ellen White wrote the following. Okay, interpret this. Perhaps it is no coincidence that on 2 separate occasions, God led Ellen White to call the Eastern question in Bible prophecy truth. You can interpret these statements here. It is in Smith's book, which Ellen White labeled God's Helping Hand, where we find the truth regarding the Eastern question plainly laid out. Read this statement. Now, interpret this statement of mine. I base this conclusion upon the fact that Ellen White prayed for the Holy Spirit to make the truth of the Eastern question plain to the listening audience. Ellen White could not have prayed for the Holy Spirit to make the truth of the Eastern question plain to the listeners unless she knew it was prophetic truth that God had already made plain to his church. Okay, now quote this slide, or interpret this slide. So why all the new theories in our church? Before July 16, 2015, we did not have access to these statements. Before July 16, 2015, we didn't have these quotations from Ellen White. And without a word from God's messenger to correct those who err from Bible truth, everyone rightfully felt free to develop and promote their own private interpretation of this prophecy. We were all ignorant of this statement because it had not yet been released from the White estate. But now that we have read this statement, what are we going to do with it? We could ignore it, explain it away, and continue presenting new theories on this important prophecy. But if we do so, wouldn't we be making of none effect the testimony of the Spirit of God? And you can interpret this quotation.
Thank you.
We should allow this statement to bring us into unity so God's church can once again speak with a united prophetic voice on this critical prophecy. So that God's church can once again speak with a united prophetic voice on this critical prophecy. Ellen White believed that Uriah Smith's interpretation of Daniel 11 represented divine truth. If we accept Smith's understanding because it is endorsed by Ellen White, we won't be in opposition to the principles of sound hermeneutics. Our pioneer's understanding of Daniel 11 was based on sound principles of prophetic interpretation. I believe that Daniel 11:45 is soon to be fulfilled. And God desires his church to give powerful public witness before this prophecy is fulfilled. The Eastern question in Bible prophecy is present truth that we must share with the world. And that is the end of my presentation on the prophetic message. It's not what the Eastern question is all about, but this is why this is Ellen White's support of this message.
Хорошо, спасибо, брат Джон. Мне было легче понимать те цитаты, которые вы приводили.
Thank you, Brother John. Andre is trying to explain that it has been simpler for him to go through the statements that were on the screen. Because by Lord's grace, we happened to do priorly we were doing a translation of the book. Sweet. And Andre is mentioning that perhaps you remember because you have seen parts of this work that he's been showing you.
That's right.
And now Andre is asking you if you are okay with moving to the second part where we would be the questions and answers Q&A, when we would be just discussing the issues regarding the
yes.
The Eastern question.
And I have one other book called Unholy War and a book called Jerusalem Caliphate and the Third Jihad. Both of those can be downloaded in English from my website, prophecywaymarks.com.